Have the Iberian Peninsula. So the place that is if you want to talk about Spain and Portugal together, you call it the Iberian Peninsula. And this is the Iberian Peninsula in 1491, where we already have Portugal. Portugal is kind of one of the very first European countries, really, to kind of assume itself as a true nation. And then we have León and Castile and Aragon and Granada. What's missing here, Ryan? What's not there? Spain. Where's Spain? Yeah, it's not there. There was no such thing as Spain. In fact, even today, we'll see, it's, the whole concept of Spain is kind of, I mean, now they consider themselves to be Spain, but it's still not linguistically unified under Spanish. But especially during this time, there's no Spain, there's Castile there. And it always puzzled me when I lived in Ecuador and Colombia, people would say, I expected people to say habla español, like, do you speak Spanish? But they ask habla castellano, which means, do you speak Castilian? And so most of the Spanish that is spoken in Latin America came from this area of Castile. And so they call it castellano. They don't actually usually, I mean, yes, they call it Spanish too, but that's kind of, has still stuck. Do you speak Castellan? So there we have it, a kind of a strange history here. Now, the history of this, of course, has to do with the Islamic Empire. And after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, there was a great expansion of Islam across northern Africa, all the way over to India. The greatest extent ruled Sicily for a while, seen as a great time in the Sicilian history, and made it all the way up to the Pyrenees Mountains in southwest France, where they were stopped, but then ruled over Spain, or ruled over the Iberian Peninsula, let us say, for a few hundred years there, a few centuries. And I think we talked about this when I talked about the rise of the West in the first class. But they gave us some words like azúcar is the Spanish word for sugar, from which we get the word sugar. You can see the resemblance, but that's actually originally a sort of derivation of an Arabic word for sugar. It looks strange in Spanish, right? What's that Z doing there? Azúcar. Or the word ojalá in Spanish, which is, if you learn Spanish, is you're taught that that means I hope. Ojalá that something will happen. Ojalá is, again, a derivation of a phrase from Islam is, may Allah grant that. So it basically means I hope, but it's kind of an invocation of Allah there. So, not to mess you up when you're speaking Spanish, but it's a little bit interesting. Also, in the Islamic Empire, they were the ones that were preserving some of the ancient Greek texts, running universities, and keeping alive the wonderful ancient traditions, which were kind of being forgotten in much of what is now considered the Western world. And of course, where would we be without Arabic numerals? There'd be no algebra, there'd be no calculus. I mean, have you ever tried to do long division with Roman numerals? You will be in very big trouble. Arabic numerals are crucial for all the mathematical operations we do today. So this is a pretty, I guess, when I say that the Sicilian, the rule by the Islamic Empire in Sicily was seen as a great time, I'm not actually making that up. If you go to the Sicilian website, they'll talk about how they brought all these advancements in architecture and irrigation and really made them civilized there. So, I mean, it was seen as in relation to the rest of Europe, Islam was actually seen as a civilizing influence, and there were a lot of people who wanted to sort of copy or saw them as something they wanted to emulate, or at least get overrun, if not copy. So in this area of the world, there's the Islamic Empire. So obviously there's Muslims, there's Christians, and there's a very sizable Jewish population there. And this has been written about in various ways. There's a book, Neighboring Faiths, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism in the Middle Ages. That was a trick question. I mean, our text says that they lived and traded in peace. I mean, to an extent. There were several centuries in which they were basically tolerating each other. Our book calls this later on the concept of convivencia, another word in Spanish, which literally means vivir is the root of live. And so convivencia literally means living together, how to live together. And it's the idea that it's kind of like, everybody lives together and gets along here. Now, there have been a lot of interpretations of this. Some people, there's a big historical debate about this. Some people are like, no, that's a myth. That's a myth promoted by Islam and other people, that these people were getting along. They weren't really getting along. That's just nostalgia for a bygone era. And it's also true that, of course, this area had been conquered by Islam and then was eventually reconquered by the Christians. So were they really getting along? I think there's a little bit of truth in both of these answers. Let's put it this way. They did live together for a few centuries. So there was a lot of convivencia. There was a lot of getting along. There was a lot of trading and stuff. It wasn't all happy times, just like anybody has no happy times. And there were fights and wars among, by the way, wars between Muslim groups. And in fact, some people in Islam think that the downfall of Islam in Spain was mostly caused by basically civil wars rather than, being pushed back by the Christians. So there were wars within Christianity as well, as we know. So but the thing is, these lines were not necessarily clear. And we also know that the Muslims didn't expel the Christians. They didn't kick them out. So they must have gotten along some way. But, I don't think we want to. Some people paint this as this glorious time that we can all go back to. And that's probably not true. But, they seem to be able to do things together. This, again, like I said, there's a big historical debate about how much they actually got along. But here we have the Iberian Peninsula in 1491. And I often ask people in my classes, if you were living in the Iberian Peninsula in 1491, what was the next thing that would happen, the most important event of 1492? But now I know I should rephrase this, because what I should still say is this. What was the most celebrated event on the Iberian Peninsula in 1492? The biggest thing, Liam. The Fall of Granada. So if you were living there, I'm not sure exactly when Columbus was stumbling over into the Caribbean, so I'm not sure exactly when the word got back. But it wouldn't have seemed like a big deal at the time. The most celebrated event was the Castilian acquisition of the Muslim kingdom of Granada. So there had been this gradual pushback of Islam from the peninsula, but Granada was allowed to remain. And they basically had to pay money in order to be independent. They left an amazing architecture in this region, just incredible stuff that was, they considered themselves to be kind of the civilized people in a world of barbaric Christians to the north. They were like, we're here being civilized and they're being weird. But yeah, this would have been the big event, is basically the expulsion of Muslims from Spain. And then this coincided more or less with a process of Spanish Inquisition whereby people were told to either convert to Christianity or leave, including Jews and Muslims. And so it was during this time that Spain becomes a Christian country. And you had to be Christian or else you were going to be in trouble, big trouble. So here we have Castile in its original form, kind of the original boundaries of Castile. What do you notice about Castile? It's landlocked. So your authors say, Restall and Lane say that, places like Portugal and Aragon and other places, they had kind of more of an orientation toward the ocean, were more cosmopolitan. Castile is up there and they can't get to the ocean. They're up there in the mountains. They're like most of you. And so they're small and landlocked. There they are in there. And what they say is that what happens is as they start to expand, they have this, they're kind of, they don't have the same sort of tolerance and convivencia they develop this intolerant pride, which becomes an imperial philosophy, right? So as they start to expand, they develop these things. Now, several of you quoted how what happens is people would fight for the king, and then the king would give them something. Castilians is on page 23. Castilians who fought on behalf of their king received 4 kinds of reward. Booty. Well, that word sounds different today, doesn't it? Treasure, let us say. Treasure. Some form of metallic stuff. Although probably they might have received that too. Land, tribute-paying subjects or slaves, I guess that would be, and higher social rank. So if you could fight for the king, then you'd achieve a higher social rank. And then as you consolidate these new lands, a new generation emerges, and there's a cycle of this. So the way you move up in society is by conquering other people, or, as Pluto noted, preying on Muslim neighbors. Preying spelled Preying, it means, stealing from them, taking their land in the name of a Christian monarch. So, I mean, this was, but, that's the thing. This was celebrated as something that was great, something good that they were doing. I mean, I think that, when we look around at our world today, I think this time period offers some lessons in how people get ginned up with these ideas that, like, doing things to other people can be justified by religion, nationalism, and portrayed as a noble cause. So we end up with eventually a Spain that looks like this. Like I said, Spain is still not linguistically unified. So now in all of this area, they speak Castilian Spanish, but in this part of Spain, they speak Spanish and Catalan, which is, related. Basque is spoken up here in this region, which is not related at all. It's a mystery kind of how it is, and even some Galician up here, and of course, Portuguese over here. So we have a pretty small area of the world, but in some ways is still to this day speaking several different languages. The Inca Empire, by the way, was far more linguistically unified than they really extended Quechua all over than the Spaniards were at the time. So what happens is we have this time of what the term La Reconquista, the reconquering of Spanish lands from Islam. But of course, that becomes a template for doing what? Once Columbus stumbles onto some new good land. You're already doing Reconquista. You just keep on going, man. You keep rolling. And so instead of trying to push further south, you push west and you do the conquista or the conquest of the Americas. And it's very weird. I mean, when you read some of these old texts, and even in places like the U.S. Southwest, um, some of you, I think I've assigned an archaeology article where, you know, they would be calling like indigenous places of worship or temples, they'd call them mosques. So they had this sort of, they have this equivalency, so for them, like the indigenous people, the Native Americans were like the infidels. They were like the bad people they had been fighting, and they made this explicit equation between them, which again, it seems weird, but it fits with the kind of ideas of the time. And like I said, it shows us what the people were in this kind of cycle of conquest mood. And they were into like burning things and being intolerant. And so you have in Castile and Portugal, we go from this idea of convivencia to, well, what do they end up in, James? From convivencia to what? What kind of a system do you have going there?
The Castilian Reconquest? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. But what do we have there? What kind of Catholicism do we got going on? Do we have nice guy Catholicism, or you just pray to the saints and light some candles and pray for peace?
This is where they're changing over.
They are
They're
changing
trying to
over.
be, like, better than having El Cid, who was known as the Moor, or well, he wasn't known as the Moor, sorry, Santiago was, right?
Yeah, well, they like that guy now.
Yeah.
He is a good guy, all said. So they go into an intensely nationalistic Roman Catholicism, right? So it's not just, it's not little grandmothers praying with candles. It's, being able, or they also call it militant Catholicism. So, using God as a way of like, hey, this justifies going in and swords and stuff. It also becomes very anti-Islamic. That's probably obvious because it's part of the Reconquest, and it also becomes anti-Semitic. So the Jews are expelled from Spain at this time. They said forced to convert, or you have to move on. So you have this sort of again, this is when we think of Europe as a Christian continent, or Spain as a Christian country, or as a Catholic country, this is a product of these historical circumstances. Later on, I mean, this is even celebrated later on. This is a painting from 1882 by Francisco Pradilla Ortiz called The Capitulation of Granada. Wikipedia has labeled all these people for us. Don't worry, none of these people will be on the quiz, Brian. You don't have to worry about that. But the general idea of the fall of Granada might be the conquest, the capitulation, the surrender of Granada. And you can see how the Spanish are all in bright light and white, and the Moors, the poor, they're being forced to leave, to hand over the architecture and stuff there. So, this leads to ideas, and it leads to the ideas that these people were warriors, but they were also religious, they were also lettered, they'd also be reading. Pluto, you like this reading warrior? It does look cool. This is the tomb of some, not remembering the reading warrior's name now, but yeah, it looks even better in color. But you know what? I looked this up. This is the picture they have in the textbook. Check this out. That's actually the full reading warrior on top of the tomb of the reading, his tomb there. Does anybody read like that? It seems like the sleeping warrior there. I don't know. Seems pretty reclined. Do you get somebody to massage your feet like that? Because what's that? Who's that guy over there? That's some weird stuff. I don't know. I think there's more of a story here. They did not reproduce the whole picture, but that sounds like a research paper, which we're not writing, but there you go. I am curious about this person. I don't know. It's little people. There. Noah, what do Spaniards do when they're out in the countryside?
Well, they farm,
They farm,
but
but
they commute back to the cities. They don't live there.
they commute. The Spaniards, our authors tell us, prefer cities, right? They would like to live in the city. If you find two Spaniards, they're always trying to found a city. And even if you owned the land, you would have a house in the city and then go back there. In fact, Ryan, you were confused by this. Why? What did they think about the countryside?
They thought it was dangerous to live out there alone.
They thought it was dangerous to live out there alone, that it was barbaric to be in the countryside. And that's why I asked you where all of you are from, because some people like being out there, being all alone, and they feel great. But some people hate it and they don't feel safe at all. My wife is a city person. She feels safe if she's in a city and there's all people around. She's out and where nobody is. She gets very nervous and scared. It's some people, it's kind of, I guess I would say it becomes a cultural thing. It's not just an individual thing, but there's sort of a cultural pattern. So, yeah, and Liam, you asked about, or I mean, who asked about, Noah, you asked about commuting. Commuting is a strange word. That's more what we do from the suburbs. So if you were a landholder, you might travel from your house in the city to oversee or stay for a while in your second house on the farm. But, well, let's deal with what are most of the people, Liam, what is it like here for most of the people in relation to the land?
3% of the population.
3% of the population owns 95% of the land. So there's enormous inequality in land ownership. So yeah, we have a great statistic there. And there's a lot of people who don't have any land at all. And I mean, still to this day in Latin America, you'd go into a city and you'd have a truck. I can imagine at this time it would have been more of a wagon or a large wagon. You load a bunch of people on and take them out, and then they work the land, and then they're basically like day laborers. It's no fun. You can see why you'd want to go conquest somebody else if you lived in this situation, right? Because you don't have any land, you don't have any title. 3% of the population owns 95% of the land. One of the best ways to get something out of your life then is to try your fate somewhere else. Get out of there. Overthrow the king and take it yourself. James, how often does that happen?
Not often. The king has a castle with walls.
I mean, this is the problem in history, right? Every time we look out over a situation, we're like, well, why don't they just rebel? You know how many people have said that about our country? Why don't people just rebel in this country? You know how many people, when I look at the Soviet, I mean at the Soviet Union. Actually, we used to say that about the Soviet Union. I mean, people say that today about Russia. Why don't they just rebel? Kick that Putin guy out. Just rebel. Right? I mean, yeah, people throughout history, they look at peasants and they're like, now, there have been some great peasant rebellions. There have been some great slave revolts. There have been things that have inspired us all. But the vast majority of people are not able to rebel. Most rebels get killed, for one thing. You get killed, and then you've rebelled. but then you're dead. So you might have did something. So it's hard to rebel. It's a very difficult thing.
If you're lucky, you might be martyred though.
You might be martyred. You might get a tomb.
That's true. That's
Yeah.
what happened to Joan of Arc.
Yeah, all those, yeah, you win freedom for somebody, but you're dead. Yeah, I mean, the problem is, rebelling is hard. And in this case, right, it's kind of like, why did poor whites in the South fight for the Confederacy? Right? Because if you can create a lower class of people than yourselves, even if you don't have anything, at least that person is below you. And in this case, they could create two lower classes, starting with the Moors, right? First, you reconquer them and you send them in, and those people are said to be inferior to you. And then you have a whole continent of Indians or Indios who you're trying to conquer and would be subservient. So in many cases, people at the top are able to preserve their power by, one, just having power and it's hard to rebel, but two, you like make them fear and hate somebody else who's in a slightly worse or even much worse position than you are. And so, I mean, this has been, this has been a classic historical question. Why did the poor whites in the South side with the rich plantation owners? Well, got some benefits. So anyway, that was happening there. Also, women. Liam, this was your quote, although you weren't the only one. Here's the quote for you. Ready? It is often assumed that Iberian societies were perversely patriarchal, if not downright misogynistic, and that women had few rights or privileges. How do you interpret that quote, Liam? Protection and partible inheritance. That is, women owning land and able to do with it what they wanted. So if a husband died, the widow would get half the estate and own that freaking land. And the daughters would get equal shares of that. Now, some of this has to do with different laws that were in place. And actually, some of it has to do with the Islamic laws that were in place. So although many people don't know this, but women in Islam had property rights centuries before most women in the West had rights to property. This area of Spain, because it was kind of intermixed and had these different laws, did have a lot of property rights for women. Now, the key here is this. These historians, when a sentence begins, it is often assumed that. What are the authors then about to do with you?
Taking the direction.
So, right, what they're going to do is say, this is what everybody assumes. I'm going to take you in a different direction. So if there's the start of this sentence, it is often assumed that Iberian societies were perversely patriarchal, if not downright misogynistic, and that women had few rights or privileges. In fact, right? So what they're doing is they're setting this up. They're saying, you all assumed this, that it was so terrible, but in fact, they had these things and they were queens and police. Now, they're not saying that it was beautiful for women, don't get me wrong, but what they're saying is this assumption that it is often assumed is actually not a fair depiction of society there. So just be careful. Historians are so weird. Anthropologists too. All right. This is kind of some crucial stuff toward the end of this chapter, crucial going into our next chapter, chapter 3, which is going to be on Atlantic Africa. And the authors, Restall and Lane, say, and I think it's important, that most textbooks have omitted, they only talk about Africa in the context of the slave trade. But what they're going to do is start to talk to us about the history of this important part and what was going on before the slave trade in Africa. But we're leading into that. But we first have this idea of, we can see that the Portuguese had sort of completed their part of the reconquest, you might say, and become an independent country. And they were seafarers. They were very sea oriented, and they were sailing west and they were sailing south down the coast and developed this naval technologies and stuff. They were sailing south. They were also sailing west too, and we'll read more about them. And yes, they had correctly calculated the circumference of the world. They knew the world was round, and they had basically figured out how big it was. And they're like, I think we'll go the other way.
I mean, the reason why Columbus was, one of the many reasons why Columbus was rejected by the Portuguese is because they thought he would just die. He would just go into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and just die there.
Right, which happened to people. And so Columbus actually wanted to sail for the Portuguese. He went to them first because they had the best ships and the best technology. And he kept wanting to do that, but they wouldn't let him. They didn't want to take that gamble because it costs a lot of money to send somebody off who's probably not going to come back. So yeah, we'll read about that later. What else were they doing in West Africa? One of the first parts of this is that, they again, as we'll read about, being enslaved was a pretty common practice throughout this region. It wasn't necessarily slavery for life, but there were various ways in which you could become enslaved, and they were brought into Portugal and brought into Spain. And Liam mentioned the very famous bustling slave market in Valencia, which is a beautiful, has anybody ever been to Valencia? Spain, Portugal? You're not on that J turn? No, yeah. Okay, yeah, it is sad. Me either, but I want to. This is Valencia. You can go there today, go to the beach. It's known as the city of art and culture and science on the Mediterranean. Beautiful city, but also had a very large market for enslaved people from Africa. Now, crucially, these enslaved Africans in Portugal and Spain. What happens, James? Are they important?
Yeah, it was crucial to life in Portugal and Spain.
Crucial to life. So yeah, it says here that they become increasingly crucial. So this is something that many people don't realize about Spain and Portugal, is that, that some of their cities and stuff get built on or built with enslaved Africans. This sentence on page 33 seems to me to be super interesting and important. So middle of page 33, Iberians who traveled to the Americas carried with them this pair of important ideas. One, that a proper household was made complete only by the presence of male and female African slaves. Whoa, right? So already by the time that people were coming to the Americas, you thought that if you were a proper household, that you would have at least two enslaved Africans, a male and a female, working there. Two, a prosperous city required an enslaved black underclass working as artisans, mule drovers, porters, and so on. Even women housed in convents were routinely served by enslaved African women and girls. So even if you were a nun in a convent, you had enslaved women working for you there. So that's a pretty incredible, a frame of reference to just, if that's your idea of what it means to have a proper home and a proper city. Now, again, most people aren't affording this because they're landless and are in a situation, but you can see how an underclass is created, by which even if you're in a convent, at least you're not getting somebody to do stuff for you. This is something that there's a legacy of this into the present. This is a couple years ago when, because Portugal and people in Spain have kind of always put this under the rug or deny it, but I mean, the role of Portugal in this slave trade and the way in which enslaved Africans were brought into the Iberian Peninsula. I mean, it's an important thing to keep in mind.